This is John Lee Dumas of Entrepreneur on Fire, and you're listening to the Veteran Resource Podcast with Jeremy Paris. Veterans, discover the programs that were created just for you.
Welcome to Veteran Resource Podcast, where you will meet nonprofit organizations focused on improving the lives of veterans and their family members. Here is your host, Jeremy Paris.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 6 of the Veteran Resource Podcast. On today's episode, I will be talking to Sean Gobin of Warrior Hike. This is a great example of a niche VSO that a lot of veterans might not know about, but I'm guessing will be very stoked to hear that it exists. In 1948, Earl Schaefer told a friend that he was going to walk off the war to work out the sights, sounds, and losses of World War II. 4 months later, Earl Schaefer became the first person to hike the entire length of the Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine. Following in Earl Schaefer's footsteps, and in recognizing the therapeutic effects of long-distance hiking, Warrior Hike has created the Walk Off the War program, which is designed to support combat veterans transitioning from their military service by through hiking America's national scenic trails. Now, before I get into the conversation with Sean, I wanted to add something new to the podcast. I was reading some of the 40-plus reviews in iTunes the other day, and I'm man enough to say that this weird water-type substance started to fill up in my eyes. I don't know. Maybe I'll get it checked out. Seriously, though, there are some really great reviews, and I thought it would be cool to read just a few of them at the beginning of each episode. So here we go. Blessed4 wrote, "Wonderful resource for veterans. Such a wonderful resource for veterans. The host, Jeremy, is an awesome storyteller. He uses his own experiences and amazing insights to provide valuable infos. Highly recommend." And Camilla Behrens writes, "Very much needed resource. I will be telling my friends and family about this podcast because some have struggled since leaving the military with jobs and adjusting to civilian life in general." And Adam Farmer TV writes, "Jeremy Paris rocks. This is such a great resource for veterans. Jeremy is helping a well-deserved community. Thank you, Jeremy." And thank you, Adam, Camilla, and Blessed4. If you have not reviewed the podcast yet, I invite you to head over to veteranpodcast.com/iTunes and click on the ratings and review tab to leave your review. And I might just be reading it at the beginning of a future episode. All right, let's get back to the interview. Captain Sean Gobin enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1994 as an infantry rifleman and received his commission upon graduating from the University of Mississippi in 2001. As an armor officer, Sean served as a platoon commander in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, and again in 2005. In 2011, Sean trained the Afghan National Security Forces in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Since separating from the Marine Corps and hiking the Appalachian Trail, Sean founded the Warrior Hike Walk Off the War program and completed his master's degree in business administration from the University of Virginia. During this interview, Sean was actually driving to Florida to meet up with 2 of his hikers on the trail. So the audio quality isn't perfect, but it's still pretty good. Let's go ahead and jump right into the interview with Sean. Sean, welcome to the Veteran Resource Podcast. Great to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
I'm especially stoked about this interview because I am an avid hiker. So when I started doing research of all of the veteran service organizations out there, I was looking for, organizations that aren't the norm. And this one really caught my eye. I've hiked a good portion of the Appalachian Trail, mostly Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and a little bit when I was down in Georgia. Shenandoah is one of my favorites, but also towards the west, out in Arizona, Sedona is just breathtaking. And really wanted to get into a lot more hiking, probably this year and moving forward. And so talking to your organization that is all about hiking, that's right up my alley.
Yeah, that's great. Those are all great spots that you mentioned.
Before we get into Warrior Hike, I really wanted to find out more about you. Want to go back into your youth before you joined the military. Where did you grow up?
Sure. So I grew up in southern Rhode Island. If you could actually break the state up into a southern region, it's, 40 minutes across driving by car. But so I grew up in southern Rhode Island, grew up on a farm. So it was always outdoors, either working on the farm or playing in the woods.
And were you pretty athletic as a kid?
I was. I did track and wrestling in high school. And then was also a big runner as well, just recreationally after that.
Oh, nice. Were you in any youth organizations like the Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, or anything like that lent itself to the outdoors?
Not so much. Most of my time was mostly dedicated to working on the farm growing up.
Oh, really? What kind of animals did you have on the farm?
We had, pigs, turkeys, chickens, geese. That's about it.
Oh, wow. Are you still very farm-oriented now, or did you really adapt to the city?
No, I'm definitely. I'm not doing any farm work at the moment, but I am definitely pre-positioned to live in rural areas now because of that upbringing. I'm not a big fan of cities at all.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth throughout my life. I grew up in Buffalo. Then once I joined the Army, kind of got a taste of Oklahoma and seeing a little bit more land. And from there, I've gone from being in the country with horses to being in Baltimore, in the city. And I think I adapt wherever I'm in. I think I like at that time.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The living out in the more rural areas is it feels a lot less low stress. And I'm much happier out there.
Yeah, you kind of get that feeling, like especially when I was up in Sedona and I was hiking, you'd get that feeling just like almost breathless. You can't help but be happy during those moments.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now, did you go into the military right after high school, or was there a break there?
No, I did 1 year of college, and at that point I decided I was going to enlist in the Marines. I was looking for something a little bit more adventurous than sitting in class and writing papers. So after my first year of college, I enlisted in the Marines.
What year was that?
That was in 1994.
Okay. In the Marines, what did you do?
When I was enlisted, I was in the infantry. I was stationed out in Hawaii. And then after my first tour, I was selected for a commissioning program. So I went back to school, got my degree, and then came back in as a armor officer in the tank community with the Marines.
Oh, wow. Was that a completely different experience from the enlisted side?
It was. Going from enlisted infantry to the officer tank side was a pretty big shift. And it was kind of funny. The reason I chose tanks is because I was tired of humping. And so ironically, what do I do when I get out? I hike 2,000 miles and start a veteran program about hiking. So
funny how that works.
Yep.
I think deep down you missed it.
I think you're right.
Okay, so then you were in for how many years?
I did 12 years active duty, and then I had my broken time while I was in college getting my degree under the commissioning program.
Okay. When you got out, what made your decision for you when you got out?
Well, I had been selected to major, and looking down the horizon, realized that life as a staff officer wasn't going to be for me. And so it essentially became a quality of life decision to get out and, try something different out on the civilian side. And so, the plan was to get out and go to grad school. And so the timing actually worked out just right, where I would get out in the springtime. Grad school started in the fall, which left me the opportunity to fulfill a dream of mine, which was to through hike the Appalachian Trail.
Nice. When you were hiking the Appalachian Trail, did you go north to south or vice versa? So
started at Springer Mountain in Georgia, and then ended up in Mount Katahdin in Maine.
Wow. What time of year was that?
Oh, let's see. I drove out of the back gate of Camp Lejeune on March 13th, 2012, and drove right to Georgia, and the next day started hiking on the 14th.
Outstanding. I've heard some different stories about hiking the Appalachian Trail, and anybody who has done the entire trail seems to have their own advice, which is usually different from everybody else. But if you had to do it again, do you think that time of year was the best to start down in Georgia?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a good timeline. What I would do different was not do it as fast. I only had 4.5 months to complete my hike because grad school started at the beginning of August. So to have taken 6 months vice 4.5 would have been a lot more enjoyable.
I can imagine. How many miles per day were you doing during that trip?
Well, a 4.5 month through hike averages out to about a little over 16 miles a day. But because I was stopping at towns along the way to meet with veteran organizations during my hike, those days I could only do about 5 to 8 miles going into town, which meant normally my average hiking day was somewhere between 18 to 22 miles a day.
Wow. Pretty impressive.
It was a lot of walking. A lot of hiking after dark.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. You were kind of used to that from the military anyway, though, huh?
Yes and no. I mean, that was one of the biggest learning points was how the military teaches you to do a forced march is the exact opposite of what you need to do to successfully complete a long-distance hike. So, in the military, you strap on 100 pounds worth of gear or more, and you walk at a breakneck pace. But, the difference is in the military, you do a forced march. It's usually going to be the end of it for at least 2 weeks, if not a month, depending on when your next hike was. But the difference in doing a long distance hike is you got to get up and, hike another 18 miles the next day. And so, you've got to be very conscious about making sure your load is as light as possible and that you're walking at a natural pace to preserve your body and not, injure yourself through an overuse injury by walking too fast. So it's a whole different mindset of how to complete a long distance hike.
I can imagine. I had a friend, Jeff Bratton, good friend of mine in the military, and when he got out, he did the Pacific Crest Trail, and he went from Mexico all the way up to Canada. And he spent a good 6 months doing that. But I think he was prepping for it, if I can remember correctly, for like a year. And during that time, he was reading all these books. He was learning how to, cook his own food with as few ingredients as possible. He was completely made, like most of his gear, like he sewed his own tent so that he could have the lightest possible tent, and it barely even fit him in it. But I remember him going through all of these steps. And to somebody like me who has never done a through hike like that, I was like, well, seems like you could just buy a tent. It might be a pound heavier, but it's not that big of a deal. But, from what he was telling me, it's a huge deal. Every little pound that you add to your pack.
Yeah, ounces equal pounds, especially when you're going to take, 5 million steps. A couple of pounds here and there starts to add up when you've got to take 5 million steps.
Absolutely. Did you do this hike by yourself, or were you in a group?
I did it with another Marine that I was in Afghanistan with. He and I decided while we were there that we were going to do this hike together. And then so, once we got back to the States and got out, we ended up doing the whole trail together.
And he got out the same time as you?
He did, yep.
That worked out great. Did you have to leave packages for yourself, like along the way? How did you get all of your gear for that big, long trip?
Well, with regards to gear, unlike your friend who prepared for a year, I did no preparation whatsoever and just grabbed a bunch of gear that I had laying around my garage and basically had to learn everything the hard way. So, like I mentioned earlier, not to hike super fast, not to carry a bunch of weight, what kind of foods I was supposed to eat. I learned everything the hard way during the first month. And it was a pretty painful month until I got it worked out. But with regards to sending yourself resupply boxes, that was an old technique that people used to use back in the day. But because long distance hiking has become so popular, a lot of the towns that the trail passes through now are very accommodating to long distance hikers. And so you can get all of the items you need in most every town that you pass through during the trail. So the need to send yourself resupply boxes isn't really necessary anymore.
Oh, that's great to know. Did you already have a plan as to which towns you were going to be stopping in to resupply, or you just kind of waited to see what you were out of?
Yeah, we did have a plan because my initial through hike in 2012, it was actually a fundraiser. We had a lot of our fellow Marines get pretty severely injured during those deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. And so my buddy and I decided that we were going to make the hike a fundraiser. And the idea was we would raise money to provide grants for veterans that were coming back that were multiple amputees to get specially modified vehicles that would allow them to drive again. So because it was a fundraiser, the design was we'd stop at all these towns along the way that had veteran organizations like VFWs, American Legions, Marine Corps Leagues, and we would talk about what we were trying to do. So because we designed the hike that way, we already had planned out each town that we were going to stop at, when we were going to be there, and which organizations we were going to connect with along the way.
And I imagine these organizations were all pretty accommodating as far as supplies and lodging and things like that?
Oh yeah, they were great. The outpouring of support was nothing short of astonishing, which really made it a great experience.
And you said that you spoke to each of these organizations that you stopped at?
Sure. So we'd get into town and, we'd meet with, for example, all the members of a VFW post, and we'd explain to them, why we were doing this hike and what the fundraiser was for. And then if they were interested in supporting our cause, they would, and they all did. And we ended up raising $50,000 over the course of 4.5 months during the hike, which we were able to issue 3 grants to purchase adaptive vehicles for seriously wounded veterans.
Wow, that is outstanding. And so this wasn't part of your organization. You hadn't started your organization at this time, correct?
Correct. The Warrior Hike, as it's designed today, really came out of happenstance because of that hike. It was during that hike, as we were doing this fundraising hike, that the notion came to mind of, wow, this should be a great transition program for veterans that were coming home from the wars. The ability to do these long distance hikes and have all that time and space to think and decompress, and then to meet all these great veteran organizations along the way. For me, it was really impactful, and it was a powerful experience. And so that's how the idea of starting Warrior Hike as a transition program came to be.
When you finished your hike, the Appalachian Trail, you said that you went off to grad school right after that, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So you didn't start Warrior Hike directly after, but your experiences from the hike really pushed you to start the organization.
Yeah, actually, it started to come together right after my hike. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy, which is the organization that manages the Appalachian Trail, reached out to us because they were interested in starting a veterans outreach program for the trail. And at that point I said, I had a really great idea of how this should be designed, and we started working together. And over the course of the winter, we pretty much launched the program as it is now. And then we launched our first Warrior Hike Walk Off the War program in spring of 2013.
And so you didn't have any experience running a business prior to starting this organization, is that correct?
Yeah, none whatsoever. And I think that's where my Marine Corps training really kicked in, especially with, the generation of which we served, where we were constantly being asked to, figure out ways to do new things and different missions that we weren't necessarily trained and equipped to do. So all of that, mindset and culture kind of kicked in, and, I just figured it out. Step one, nothing exists without a website. So I had to figure out how to build a website, so put together the website and, then built out the, based off my hike that I did, built out what the plan would look like up the trail and where the stops would be. And then just started, cold calling all of these different outdoor manufacturers and retailers trying to get gear donated. And, we put the word out, and within 2 weeks had our first batch of veterans that wanted to through hike the Appalachian Trail, and met them down in Georgia, got them kitted up, and away we went.
That was a pretty quick transition from no organization to getting troops out there. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it was a really quick turnaround.
I guess your cold calling techniques are pretty substantial.
Yeah, I don't know how or why that worked, but it did. And in a matter of 2 weeks, the timing was so close that I essentially had to have all of the shipped to Georgia. because there wasn't enough time to get it to me before I would meet them in Georgia. So I had them meet me in Georgia, and the gear met us in Georgia, and thankfully it was all the right gear, and we were able to get it sorted out and issued out to the veterans that were going to be hiking that year. And yeah, it all came together by the seat of our pants.
I think you're right. I think that the skills that you learn in the military really are in line with the skills of running an organization, entrepreneurship, and things like that. Because running a business, it's the same type thing where you're just starting out and you're kind of winging it, but you have to take charge and just kind of push through and do it. And then everybody around you starts to see, okay, this guy, he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, exactly right. All those skills definitely transferred right over. And the other thing that helped is I was in grad school during all of this and getting my MBA. And the MBA program, it was a great way to basically tweak all of your skill sets as a Marine Corps officer and translate that into, how to run a business organization. So it really, really helped become a seamless transition of one skill set to the next.
And so where is the organization based out of right now?
Out of Charlottesville, Virginia.
Oh, okay. I was thinking you were further up north. And so I wanted to get into more about the Walk Off the War program that you're running. That's your main program, correct?
Correct.
Okay. In the Walk Off the War program, I saw something about it going back to World War II. Is that accurate?
That's correct. The very first person to through hike the entire length of the Appalachian Trail was actually a World War II veteran by the name of Earl Schaefer. He was a United States Army veteran that came back. He fought actually in the Pacific Campaign. And after returning home in 1945, kind of floated around for a few years and was pretty distraught. And so one day, told his family and friends that he was going to go walk off the war, and grabbed his military rucksack and went down to Georgia. And then 4 months later became the very first person to hike the entire Appalachian Trail.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. I didn't realize that first person to hike that was somebody that was walking off the war.
Exactly right.
Now, you were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you feel that some of the same effects that he speaks about with as far as walking off the war when you hiked?
Yeah, absolutely. The three things that were really impactful to me, which is the baseline for how I framed the organization, was first and foremost, just hiking 8 hours a day for months on end. It's a great way just to clear your head, and it gives your mind the time and space it needs to process everything you've gone through. Because while you're active duty, especially during the time I was in, you're essentially on assembly line. You're either on a deployment or you're training up for the next deployment. And so there was no decompression time between deployments or after coming home. And another interesting nuance to that was you look historically, armies used to march home, and there's been theories out there that say that act of marching home was really, therapeutic for military forces as they came home from a campaign. Whereas today, in the age of modern transportation, you can transition right from being on the battlefield doing combat operations to within a few days you're back home, driving down 95 or inside a Walmart, and that constant back and forth transition that's so abrupt could be a lot of the causes for the epidemic of post-traumatic stress that we're seeing nowadays. So again, to have that hike, to have 6 months just to hike in nature away from TVs, cell phones, computers, it really gives your brain the ability to process and decompress. That was one of the first things that I found was really impactful. The second thing was doing it with another veteran is really great, because now you're going through this process with somebody else who's going through something similar. And so to have that group dynamic of doing these hikes with other people that are going through something similar really helps as you talk through what you're going through during the process. And then the third thing that was really impactful was, again, by happenstance, we were doing fundraisers with these veteran organizations along the way, but in actuality, meeting with all of these community groups and veteran organizations was also very therapeutic, because you're making connections to all of these great people. And something that we see a lot is a lot of times veterans will come home and become very isolated and have a very cynical view towards society because of what they experienced on the battlefield. And so to do these hikes and to connect with all these wonderful people along the way, really reestablishes that basic faith in humanity that you may have lost, and also helps to reintegrate you socially back into society.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like it could be beneficial. And so for your troops that are walking off the war, do you have them stop at these different military organizations that you stopped at as well?
Exactly. So about once a week, it's worked out where once a week the trails will pass through a small community, and then we plug into those community and veteran organizations, and we ask them to essentially host our veterans during their journey. And so what that means is they'll provide them a ride to and from the trailhead. They'll put them up for the night, either in a hotel or at their homes. And then they'll usually put together a meal, a community dinner for them to sit down and get a good hot meal in their stomachs before they get back on the trail the following day.
Oh, that is great. So they're getting a very similar experience to what you just mentioned for yourself.
Exactly.
Who can apply for this? Can any veteran apply to join the Walk Off the War program, or is it just for certain people?
Yeah, it's any veteran who's served in a combat zone and that has been honorably discharged can apply to our program.
Okay, great. My brother just retired from the Air Force, and he was deployed out to the sand more times than I can remember. And I think he would definitely benefit from this. He's out in Arizona, and I did see that you do some hikes out in Arizona as well.
Yeah, we actually just added the Arizona Trail this year, and we've got our first group of 2 veterans that are hiking on the Arizona Trail as we speak.
Oh, really? It's happening right now?
Yep, it sure is.
How long is that hike?
The Arizona Trail is 800 miles, and it's about 2.5 months to complete. 2 months to complete.
Oh, I think that would be perfect. That would be great. I love everything about Arizona, too.
Yeah, it's a beautiful trail. It goes through the Grand Canyon, and it's just really beautiful desert terrain to hike through.
Does it hit Sedona as well?
I'm not sure. I'm not sitting in front of my map. It could be.
Oh. That would be great if it does. I don't know. There's something spiritual about walking through there with the red rocks and everything. Something that you said earlier, you were talking about while you're walking the trail, your perspective kind of changes. My friend Jeff that walked the trail, he walked with his girlfriend who was also a soldier and just got out, Amy Goodrich. And she wrote a blog, and she was a writer by trade, I think. But she wrote this amazing blog during her hike where she was talking about the different things that she's seeing and experiencing and feeling. And one of the things that she mentioned was that she would be walking along the path and that was right next to the highway. They would stop and they would just kind of take it in where these people are flying by at 60, 70 miles an hour, like so in a hurry to get to wherever it is they're going. At the same time, like parallel to them, only a couple 100 feet away is all of this beauty that they're experiencing walking through it. And she said that she was just like overwhelmed with what they were experiencing and thinking about how much was being missed by these people, not too far away from them.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking in the world at the speed of, walking pace, it really does open up your eyes you become very in tune with nature. You become very in tune with, the sounds of all the different wildlife, the smells of the different plant life. You become very in tune with the changes in weather and temperature. And it's an interesting dynamic to experience while you're out on the trail for a long time.
Were there any scares or anything like that, like shortages of water or anything?
No, not so much. The Appalachian Trail is pretty plentiful with water sources, so nothing quite like that. I'd say the only evening that really had the hair stand on the back of my neck was when I was in New Jersey, which is notorious for their bear population. We were camping up on a ridgeline, and as soon as we got into the tents and the sun went down, you just heard something crashing through the woods and up towards where the tents were, and then made a right-hand turn and basically ran up the trail. So that was probably my closest encounter at night with a bear.
Wow. Yeah, I've seen bears on the trail in Shenandoah, Skyline Drive, many times where I'd be hiking through there, and there would be just one, or you'd have the mom and a couple cubs. And a few times we saw them up in the trees as we were walking by. And every single time it's that combination of, the absolute beauty of nature with fear for your life.
Yeah. Yeah. The good thing about the black bears, though, is 99 times out of 100, they're just going to see you, be spooked, and run the other way. Now that's a little bit different with the grizzly population out west, but with the black bears, yeah, you're normally okay.
Speaking about west, do you have trails out there that people can hike on as well for Walk Off the War?
Correct. Yeah. So our first year in 2013 was along the Appalachian Trail, which goes from Georgia to Maine. And in 2014, we expanded to what's known as the Triple Crown Trails, which are the 3 long-distance trails that traverse the United States. So the second one was the Pacific Crest Trail that goes from the Mexican border in Southern California up to the Canadian border in Washington, and the Continental Divide Trail, which starts at the Mexican border in New Mexico and goes up through the Rockies and ends at the Canadian border in Montana. So last year we were on all 3 of those long-distance trails.
Wow. And is that all of the trails that you do, or are there more?
So this year we also added 3 what I consider state-level trails. And that's the 1,200-mile Florida Trail, the 800-mile Arizona Trail, and then also the 1,200-mile Ice Age Trail that traverses through the state of Wisconsin. And the design, or the idea behind those trails, and that design was they're a little bit shorter, so they take 3 months, vice 6 months to complete, and they're also co-located within one state. And so the idea was to have veterans from that state hike their state's trail. And the added benefit to doing that is they're actually connecting with people within their own state that could act as a support network at the end of their hike to help them, transition to the next chapter of their life, whatever that may be.
Oh, that's a great idea. And between the long hikes and the shorter hikes, you're really covering most of the map there.
Correct.
So no matter where a soldier gets out or transitions to after they leave, there's something for them.
Exactly.
Do you have any plans for going outside of the United States?
There actually are a number of really cool trails that I've become aware of. One of them is called the E1 Trail that goes across Europe. There's also another really interesting trail that goes around New Zealand that they recently completed. So there's a couple of international trails that I'd like to eventually branch out and explore too.
Oh, that would be great. One of the ones on my list is, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Way with Emilio Estevez and Martin Sheen, but Emilio Estevez is hiking along the Way, which I think he's doing the Way of St. John or something along those lines, but it goes from France to Spain, and he ends up dying, and then Martin Sheen, his father, goes to collect his things and ends up going and saying, okay, I'm going to do the trail for him, and he ends up hiking. And just the character development of Martin Sheen over the course of that hike, I'm sure is pretty equivalent to what you're seeing with some of these veterans that you're working with. But if nobody's seen that movie, if any listeners out there haven't seen the movie, highly recommend it.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people mention that trail and kind of the similar experience that happens along that trail with what our program does. Essentially, it's a pilgrimage for people that are trying to find their way. So yeah, it's very similar with its design.
And for your trails, each of your trails, there's a specific time. It's not, you can't just say, I want to do the Arizona trail and, pick whatever date you want and go. You have it pre-scheduled each year. Is that correct?
The trails go once a year, and those timelines that they're scheduled is essentially the ideal time of the year to do each one of those trails.
Okay, great. And so they could find out all about what the timelines are on the website. Is that correct?
Correct.
How do they apply to become a part of this? Sure.
If you go to the website, we've got an online application form that you can fill out. And then after you fill that out, you send in a copy of your DD-214 and VA rating letter. And then in December is when we screen all of our applications to select the veterans that'll be hiking on all the different trails for the following year.
Oh, great. for the listeners out there that might be thinking about doing a hike with you, what exactly is provided by your organization? Is it just like lodging along the way? Is it a guide or supplies or things like that?
Sure. So the first thing that we provide is all of the equipment, clothing needed to do a hike. And we've got a vast number of sponsors that provide all of the hiking equipment and clothing that you'll need along the way. The next thing that we provide is we coordinate all of the what we call trail town support with all the communities that you'll pass through. So all those hosting opportunities for you to have a place to stay when you come off the trail every weekend. And then we also provide a $300 monthly stipend, which is intended for you to buy all of your resupply items each week while you're in town.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. I imagine that adds up pretty quickly. So you have a lot of sponsors, I take it. Do you also have donations coming in to help supply these?
We do. It's been, it's been really great that when people hear about our organization, they've been really generous with donating. And so, each year we're able to put, more and more veterans out on the trails.
So for the listeners out there that are absolutely loving this, but maybe you don't qualify or your life doesn't allow you to take 6 months off and go for the hike, you could still be a part of it. You could still donate to the organization. And I imagine they could find everything they need to be able to donate on the website as well.
Correct.
Great. And I'll make sure that I put links to all of those things as far as the application and donating and everything in the show notes. I think we're about ready to answer the final 3 questions. Are you ready, Sean?
Sure.
Okay. Question number 1. Who would you like to hear on a future episode of Veteran Resource Podcast?
I think another great organization that's out there is Team Red, White, and Blue. And the way they work is they have chapters all over the United States, and they organize athletic events or outside activity events where veterans and community members can come together and do all of these great things outside as a way to help connect veterans with their local communities. So they do a lot of 5Ks and hikes and, you name it. They always have something going on. So it's just a great way to get out and socialize with other veterans and, be active and then also to meet members of your community.
That's a great organization. I've had the pleasure of working alongside them on a couple of events. So I will definitely reach out to them. Okay, question number 2. What upcoming project has you fired up right now?
Sure. So another program that we're getting ready to launch is called Warrior Paddle. And that is going to be a 2,300-mile, 5-month-long paddling expedition down the entire length of the Mississippi River. And the idea behind creating Warrior Paddle is because a lot of the veterans that are coming home because of the IED threat in Iraq and Afghanistan are coming home with lower extremity injuries that do not necessarily allow them to be able to hike 2,000 plus miles, but they can paddle. So this summer we're going to launch Warrior Paddle, which will be a canoe trip down the entire length of the Mississippi River, and we'll set up support along the way, just like we do with our hikes, and that'll be an option available towards some of our more seriously injured veterans that are coming home.
That is a really great idea. Okay, getting into question number 3. If you woke up tomorrow, you found out that somebody made an anonymous donation of $10 million to your organization, what would you do with the money?
I would expand the program so I could, get any veteran that was interested in doing one of these hikes the opportunity to do so. Right now we're limited by resources. So, for example, we were only able to put, approximately 30 veterans out on the trails this year. So if I were to have unlimited funding, I would like to have a warrior hike on a trail in every state in the United States. And then additionally to branch out to some of those international trails, and then also to set up paddling trips around the United States, shorter paddling trips as well. So the answer would be to be able to accommodate anybody who would want to go on one of these trips would be what I would like to do with that money if possible.
I think that would be a very good use of that money. And if any listeners out there happen to have an extra $10 million laying around and this sounds like it's up your alley, make sure you hit the show notes, get in contact with Sean, and send your donation on over.
Yeah, and we'll be able to provide you a receipt for that, so no worries.
Outstanding. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming onto the podcast, Sean. This has been an absolute pleasure for me.
All right, thanks. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, take care, Sean. All right, so who wants to go for a hike? I know I do. As I mentioned in the intro, the sound quality was not ideal. You can hear some of the hail in the background and some road noise, things like that. But Sean was pretty crunched for time, and we managed to get the interview in. So I'm pretty stoked about that. And make sure you hit up the show notes at veteranpodcast.com/006. You can find out more about Sean and Warrior Hike. And you can also find all of the links to get back to his website, where you will find the applications. Also find information about donating to Warrior Hike. And I will see you in episode 7.